Hello, this is Dr. Mike Brooks. I'm a licensed psychologist and the director of the Austin Psychology and Assessment Center, or ApaCenter. Today we're going to be doing part 7 of the topic, Does Video Game Violence Cause Children and Adolescents to Become Violent? And in this one we're going to look at the summary and implications of the video game violence research. So I have my iPad again and I'll be going over this point by point. And again, the qualification is this is a moving target. There's research coming out all the time, but I'm doing my best here to summarize what's out there and make some sense of it to help you out. So here we go. First off, point number 1, there's a mixed effects of gaming, but family and peers should matter more. So it's funny because just today there was a study done that was published. It was from the Netherlands on the effects of pornography on boys ages 15 to 25, and it did say that it can have an effect, but that family and peers and the environmental context, the socioeconomic status matter a lot more. And with video games, there's kind of that same thing, is that they can have an effect, and we don't want to be dismissive of that, but there's a much greater environmental context that affects children's behavior than just video games. Video games are a very small part of that. And as a related point, you don't want your child playing too much of video games, and I'd say positive or negative video games, even the ones that are beneficial. That old saying of too much of a good thing isn't good, so even on some games that are cognitively stimulating, you don't want your kid playing 24/7 of those games. Got to set realistic limits, and we don't want, in particular, kids to be playing a lot of violent video games. Okay, next point. Some people will become psychopaths despite any clear influences. So that's been known. Some of the shooters recently, the Virginia Tech shooter, at first there were questions about whether he played violent video games, and then after looking at it more, it doesn't look like he did, or to the extent he did, it was very, very minor. And some people, it's very hard to tell what went wrong with I heard on Ted Bundy, they didn't know why he became a serial killer. Really, there was nothing super traumatic about his childhood that could have accounted for how he became the psychopath he ended up being. So it could be, though, that for some kids, that's the last thing that they need, is the violent video game, exposure to violent video games and playing those violent video games. So there's a question of, could it be the last straw for some kids? And I think that's a pretty fair question, that there are some kids you don't want playing these types of games because possibly could push them over the edge. Next point, younger children should not be playing games with M or T ratings. And I've sort of touched on this before. That's why they have these ratings, it's for parents to see that these games are intended for a more mature audience. So, the question of, does an 8-year-old playing Call of Duty 10, 20 hours a week, does that have an effect? Well, you couldn't even pass such a study through the ethics board because they wouldn't allow it. Just as you wouldn't let an 8-year-old watch a lot of pornography, a 8-year-old should not be allowed to play M-rated games. Next point, the type of violence depicted needs to be taken into consideration. So this is a real important point in part of my dissertation research when I looked at this, and I think I will post my dissertation, so you'll see that up soon. That graphically sophisticated does not mean realistic. So a game like Call of Duty is much more realistic than a game like Halo. Even though certain violent games both might have M ratings, the type of violence that's depicted can be very different, and parents need to be very cognizant of that. And then the other with games like Grand Theft Auto, where you play as the antagonist, not the protagonist, the antagonist. You're the bad guy that does robberies and killings and runs prostitution rings and, you know, sells drugs, all these things, that I don't think it's the healthiest thing for kids to be identifying with that type of mindset. So here's some more thoughts, more in the summary and implications of the video game violence research. The relationship between video game violence and aggression is complex. So when we're trying to understand this link, it really is a very complex, thorny issue, because people who are aggressive are also drawn to violent forms of media, including violent video games. So then it gets to be the chicken and egg question, is if a person acts out violently or aggressively, was it because of the video games, or were they playing the video games because they're a violent and aggressive person to begin with? And then on a related note, that those type of people that are drawn to aggression and violence to begin with are also going to be drawn to other forms of media that contain aggression and violence, and that may be in the form of movies or YouTube videos, TV shows, music they listen to. So then it gets very difficult to try to isolate the effect of video game violence when it's nested in all the other violent media. So another summarizing point: the negative effects of gaming violence would most likely be found with young kids under age 8, and these are the kids who should not be playing these games to begin with. So there's a body of research that shows that aggression is generally a learned behavior, and it's generally learned before the age of 8, and then it can get trait-like in its stability, so that the very aggressive child is more likely to be aggressive as an adolescent, who's more likely to be aggressive as an adult, and it makes some sense. So if we're saying that there's some truth to that, and again, there's a body of research to support that general line of thinking, and it makes some intuitive sense as well, is these very young kids are the very ones who should not be playing these T-rated and M-rated violent games. So if we just don't, cross those streams, I think then we're much more likely to protect kids from being influenced by some of these violent video games. Another important point is, as video games evolve and become more immersive, the potential for positive and negative effects increases. So over the years, when I first started playing video games, they were very mild in terms of, Space Invaders and Asteroids and Centipede and Missile Command and things like that, Donkey Kong. I mean, it was very cartoonish. Even the most violent games, it was very symbolic in the representation of violence. It just could not depict it in a very realistic way or sophisticated way. And as time has gone on, these games have gotten more and more graphically sophisticated. And if there is a learning effect of violence, and again, a lot of the research uses learning models to understand why exposure to violence can increase aggression. Usually learning models plus desensitization to violence, and kind of those two coupled together could explain it, and that people encode the information that they're learning from the video game into scripts that can guide their behavior. As these depictions of violence are much more realistic and look like everyday scenes, there's the potential that these behavioral scripts and this information is encoded into memory to guide future behavior. So the potential is there, and I would say it increases with each passing year as video game developers try to create more and more immersive experiences for kids and adults. And the last point I want to make here is a really important one, and I've sort of touched on it, but I want to kind of drive it home here. And it is, blaming violence on the media is easier and safer than tackling the larger contributing factors such as family violence, racism, access to guns, poverty, inadequate parental involvement, social injustice. The list could go on and on. So a lot of times when there is violence and a tragedy in our society, we're trying to understand why, and that's really good to do that. But it's a lot easier to point our fingers at video game violence and say, aha, if it weren't for these darn violent video games, this tragedy wouldn't have happened. And I think that's very reductionistic and a vast oversimplification of a very complex problem, because there are other factors, as I was talking about, like family context, and if parents are violent and aggressive toward their child, or they grow up in a whole culture that is very that rewards aggressive behavior, for instance, and it's sanctioned within a subculture or a peer context, those factors tend to influence a person a lot more. But those are very thorny to try to solve at a societal level. So I think people are quick to point to video games. And again, we need to look at video games and we need to look at the content, but we also need to look at the bigger picture and ask ourselves, what is the true story here going on why some kids end up mass murderers and very aggressive and violent, and how much of that is really video games and how much of it is other stuff. And as we've talked about before, and looking at the trends in violence in society, it can't be the case that video games cause a huge impact on kids and adolescents, because given the number of these games out there and the number of players of them that are young, we would see violence at a proportion that human history hasn't seen. And that's just not the case. So these are some of my summary thoughts and implications. I hope you found them helpful. And now in the next segment, I'm going to talk about what parents can do, what you can do as a parent. And again, I'm a parent too, have 3 boys. So we'll cover this in the next segment. Thanks so much for joining me today. My name is Dr. Mike Brooks. I'm a licensed psychologist and the director of the Austin Psychology and Assessment Center, or ApaCenter. I hope to see you back next time for our final segment of this topic.